It had been years since I'd felt truly seen by my daughter-in-law, but tonight she would witness the woman I had become. The evening was heavy with unspoken words as Helen walked into the dimly lit dining room, the scent of roast chicken mingling with her growing anxiety. Her son Mark had promised this would be different. A dinner, a moment of peace, but she knew better. Claire, always sharp, always on edge, had already set the stage. Helen smiled, though the tension in her chest tightened with every second. "Dinner smells wonderful," she said, trying to force lightness into the conversation. "I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates." I was nervous but hopeful. Little did I know that dinner would change everything. The evening air smelled of fading summer blossoms as Helen pulled into her son's driveway, heart fluttering like a hummingbird in her chest. The front porch light was glowing, Mark's welcome call still echoing in her mind. Hope had crept back into her posture after so many blank weekends. Tonight felt different. She stepped inside, balancing the familiar weight of her favorite covered casserole dish, chicken pot pie, Claire's childhood favorite. She'd layered pastry just so, hoping to say, "I care." The kitchen was warm with chatter, glasses had clinked already, and Claire was at the stove, spoon in hand, stirring something Helen couldn't yet see. "Mom!" Mark greeted her with a hug that smelled of fresh laundry and spiced cider. He looked tired, but genuine. His tie was loosened, and his eyes brightened when he saw her. "Hi, honey," Helen said, smoothing her apron. "It smells lovely." Claire paused and turned. She smiled, a professional smile, edged with something polite but distant. "Welcome, Helen. Come in." She gestured toward the dining room. Helen admired the table setting, linen napkins, polished silver, glasses arranged just the way she used to do for family holidays. Moments later, they were all seated. Conversation began gently, Mark talking about his latest work project, Claire describing a recent weekend getaway. Helen felt her chest loosen, relief washing over the knots of doubt she'd carried in. As Helen took her seat, she offered the pot pie, steam bellowing like expectation. Claire accepted with a nod. Helen watched, breath steadying, as Claire scooped soup from a tureen and ladled it into everyone's bowls. The soup simmered, rich golden broth with strands of chicken and fresh herbs. Pie and soup, Helen's favorites, from childhood memories around this same table. Helen gripped her spoon, ready to tuck into her own meal when Claire raised an eyebrow, pausing mid-pour. Helen's hope faltered. Claire's gaze flicked upward, lips tightening for a moment too long. Then Claire's spoon hit her lips, a dramatic inhale drawn through her nose. Helen's throat tightened. "Is?" Claire swallowed, set her spoon down, then abruptly leaned forward. The edge of her mouth curled, and she spit into the bowl. Helen froze. The soup trembled with ripple. Everyone's eyes locked on Claire's motion. An echo of dinner table etiquette stretched between them, snapped. Mark's chair scraped. He swallowed, half standing. Claire wiped the corner of her mouth and stood, chest heaving. I couldn't just pretend, Helen. Helen's heart plummeted. The pot pie, the carefully selected wine, the dinner's fragile warmth, it all shattered in that second. Claire's voice, strained. Your checking in doesn't fix years of absence." A silence hung, thick as fog. The candle flames wavered. Helen's mind looped back through empty phone calls, birthdays unanswered, holidays neglected. The tension she'd hoped to ease had only deepened. Mark put a hand on Claire's arm to steady her. "Claire, please," he murmured. Claire pulled away, looking both anguished and resolute. She sat back down, eyes fixed on the bowl she had just desecrated. Helen's mouth went dry. She looked at Mark, his jaw tense, and then across at Claire, whose hands gripped the bowl like ballast. "Mom," Mark said softly, "you wanted tonight." But he paused, eyes flicking between them. Helen swallowed, swallowing more than breath, the truth she'd been inching toward. Some things aren't fixed at one dinner. Claire's tears glistened in the candlelight, not of shame but of something sharper. Helen's favorite dish sat untouched between them, warming on the table like an unanswered question. Helen's fingers trembled as she reached for her wine glass. Claire glanced up, eyes raw. The air crackled around them. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be gentle and it would change everything. The spit hit the soup like a slap to my face. My heart sank, and I froze. Helen sat rigid in her chair, vision blurred by shock. The soup spoon hovered in Claire's hand, droplets still falling. The golden broth swirled with ripples of betrayal. An image burned into her mind. Claire laughed, a hurried, fragile edge to it. "Sorry, just too salty," she said, her tone dismissive. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin as if nothing had happened, then reached for bread. Helen forced a polite smile, clearing her throat. "Oh, no worries," she murmured, voice brittle. She scooped pie into her bowl, but the creamy pastry felt flat on her tongue. Mark looked from Claire to Helen, confusion flickering in his eyes. He didn't speak, he simply resumed sipping his wine, as though swallowing anger along with embarrassment. The candles rattled softly, and the far corner of the room felt frigid. The laughter from earlier dinners, warm, easy, was gone, replaced by a tension that sank deep into Helen's bones. Claire's manner shifted. She leaned forward, elbows on table, tone theatrical. "You know, Helen, I just wanted to see your reaction." Her smile was sharp, sarcastic. "I mean, pot pie's your thing, right? Classic, safe." Helen inhaled slowly, darkness licking at her chest. She searched for calm. Years of maternity, of care, had infused her with grace under fire. "Until this," she said nothing. Claire continued, arms unfolding like claws. "It's not personal, just, I thought it'd make things interesting." She smirked, taste of cruelty in her words. Too boring otherwise. Silence thickened. Mark clenched his jaw, eyes dark. He said nothing. Helen's spoon trembled. She gathered herself, lips pressing together, until the tautness throbbed behind her teeth. Claire leaned back, laughter subdued. "Relax, Mom, just dinner drama." She took another bite. Helen burned from embarrassment. Mark finally exhaled. "Claire, this is not dinner theater." His voice was low. Claire rolled her eyes. Helen swallowed back the thump in her throat. She wanted to stand, to say something fierce, no more emotional games, but her body still felt rooted. Claire leaned across toward Helen. "You're so sensitive, aren't you? I just thought," she looked for Mark's approval, "you could lighten up." Helen took a measured breath. She pictured herself as the mother she'd been, kind, patient. Now compassion and indignation warred within her. The guests, none but Mark, sat quiet. The soup in everyone's bowls cooled, soup once nourishing now tainted. Helen decided. She stood slowly, napkin in hand, chairs scraped. Claire's eyes flitted with amusement. Mark's lips parted, as if to stop her. But Helen shook her head. "Excuse me," she said softly, voice breaking. She walked away before she could feel the tears coming. In the kitchen, the light was bright but unwelcoming. Helen leaned against the counter, hot trembling tears slipping free. She closed her eyes and pressed palms to her eyes, tasting bile. The sound of a spoon hitting a bowl drifted in from the dining room. Claire's forced laughter. Mark's silence. They felt like blows. Helen brushed the tears away, reminded herself of every silent apology she'd swallowed. She could no longer stay neutrally polite in the face of shame. She opened the sink, ran water, and cupped her face. The cool splash snapped something inside her. She straightened, mouth firm. She reached for a towel, her shoulders straightened, awareness sinking in. This wasn't just a moment of humiliation. It was a boundary broken. Helen drew a steadying breath, and walked back toward the dining room. She didn't know what she'd say. Apology, confrontation, departure, but she wouldn't stay silent. Power thrummed at her fingertips. As she crossed the threshold, she paused, the door opening to what she refused to walk away from, but also what she could no longer ignore. Helen paused in the doorway, heart pounding. Inside, Claire's laugh echoed, and Mark stared at her with pleading eye. She opened her mouth, and the world held its breath for what came next. I couldn't speak. Instead, I let my silence be my revenge. Helen lingered in the kitchen, the hush around her thickening with each passing second. A minute ago, she'd walked out humiliated, furious, but composed. She hadn't shouted, hadn't cried, not in front of them. Now, her back pressed to the refrigerator, she stared down at her trembling hands. The soup, the spitting, Claire's condescension, it echoed in her ribs like laughter in a cavern. Rage simmered. But rage, she knew, was useless here. She would not shout. She would not beg. She would not give Claire the pleasure of watching her unravel. Instead, she would be still. Helen turned to the counter. Slowly, methodically, she ladled another bowl of soup. The broth gleamed under the kitchen light. She wiped the bowl's edge with a cloth napkin, aligning the spoon at the perfect angle, just like her mother used to. As she stepped out of the kitchen, her face smoothed into a serene mask. Not fake, controlled, practiced. Her spine straight, she returned to the table, and placed the soup before Claire. Claire blinked, caught off guard. Wow, a refill. How generous. Helen didn't flinch. She sat down and folded her napkin. It's tradition, she said simply. Mark glanced up from his phone. Everything okay? Helen smiled. Perfect. Claire snorted and took a sip of wine. You're quiet tonight. Helen didn't respond. She lifted her own spoon, tasted the broth, and resumed eating in silence, a quiet that pulsed. Claire tapped her spoon. No witty comebacks, no dramatic exit, just soup. Helen met her gaze with a level look. I've found quiet makes things clearer. Claire narrowed her eyes, but said nothing. For the next few minutes, only the soft clinking of silverware filled the room. Helen's silence was not a retreat. It was a stance, a shield. Mark cleared his throat. Claire, didn't you say your boss moved up the deadline on that campaign? Claire, irritated, turned to him. Yeah, she's impossible. Helen listened, but said nothing. She sliced into her pot pie and chewed with care, savoring every flavor, her own recipe, her own memory. Claire shifted in her seat, unnerved. Something you want to say, Helen? No. Helen folded her hands. But I'm paying attention. That hit deeper than any accusation. Claire took another sip of soup, her shoulders stiffening. Still salty, she muttered. Helen kept her eyes on her plate. The room, once Claire's stage, had shifted. Mark scrolled his phone again. Anyone want dessert? No, both women answered, their voices overlapping. Mark looked up, brows raised. Claire rolled her eyes and leaned in. You going to eat that or just stare at it? Helen didn't blink. She placed her spoon down with quiet precision, and lifted her eyes slowly, deliberately. I think I'll wait, she said, voice calm as marble. After all, I wouldn't want to offend your palate. Claire's expression faltered. Just a flicker. Is this your way of making me feel guilty? Helen tilted her head. No, guilt doesn't come from soup. Claire shifted again. The silence returned, but now it belonged to Helen. Helen looked at Mark. Sweetheart, you said you were working late this week? Yeah, he said, glancing up. Every night. Why? No reason. Helen turned her attention back to her bowl, just noticing how little changes, even when everything Claire stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping loudly. I need air. She stepped onto the back patio, the screen door clattering shut. Mark looked at Helen, then back at the door. What just happened? Helen took a sip of wine. Just dinner. From the porch, Claire's silhouette leaned on the railing, staring into the dark. Inside, Helen placed her spoon down, and sat back, a quiet storm rising behind her eyes. This wasn't finished, not yet. Silence, I realized, could speak louder than any words I could muster. Claire's silhouette still lingered on the back patio, lit dimly by the porch light. Helen watched through the dining room window for a beat, shoulders hunched, arms crossed, mouth muttering into the dark. A woman unraveling in slow motion. Helen didn't move. Instead, she picked up her napkin, dabbed the corner of her mouth, and resumed eating. Her jaw moved with quiet rhythm, her pulse steadying with each silent bite. Mark stirred beside her, uneasy. Mom, what's going on? Helen set down her fork. I'm just enjoying my food, darling. He looked at her, then toward the patio. She's upset. She's dramatic, Helen replied, her tone soft and even. Always has been. She could feel the weight shifting slowly, deliberately. Claire's games had worn thin. Now it was Helen who sat still and clear-eyed, while Claire flailed in the dark. Minutes passed. Claire returned, the screen door groaning behind her. She walked in like a storm, refusing to make landfall. Too much thunder, no rain. Is everything okay in here? She asked, the edge of her voice too casual. Lovely, Helen said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Claire sat down with a forced sigh, glancing at Mark. It's a bit chilly outside. Mark nodded absently. You all right? Claire picked up her spoon. Of course, just needed air. Helen refilled her water. Her silence thickened, not passive, commanding, a silence that made the clinking of cutlery sound like a countdown. Claire cleared her throat. So Helen, nothing to say? Helen folded her hands. Would it change anything? Claire scoffed. You're playing the saint again. Still, Helen said nothing. Mark pushed his plate back. Okay, what am I missing? Neither woman answered. The candles flickered between them like witnesses. Claire tried again, voice sharper now. You've always loved playing the martyr, but you can't stay silent forever. Helen tilted her head. No, but I can choose when to speak. And to whom? Mark blinked. Claire, seriously. What happened? Claire opened her mouth, but Helen stood abruptly, gathering dishes with careful grace. I'll fetch more soup, she said gently. Claire, would you like another bowl? Claire hesitated. Sure, why not? Helen carried the bowls to the kitchen. Inside, the air felt clearer, her footsteps grounded. She opened a second pot on the stove, one she'd set aside earlier. It looked identical to the first but tasted different. She ladled a portion carefully, garnishing it with a sprig of parsley. Just as before, she didn't rush. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about precision. Returning to the table, Helen placed the bowl in front of Claire. Here you go. Claire peered down. Same soup? Helen smiled. Exactly. Claire dipped her spoon. Well then, let's see if it's still too salty. Helen sat, folded her napkin again. Across from her, Claire took a bite. Mark watched the exchange, eyes narrowing. Claire chewed, blinked, swallowed. Better actually. Helen's expression didn't change. I'm glad. Claire raised a brow. Something's different. Just tradition. Helen said, her voice serene. Some flavors take time. Claire took another spoonful. Well, maybe you can teach me sometime. Helen tilted her head. Some things can't be taught. They have to be earned. The room went still. Mark looked between them. What's going on? Helen met his gaze. A lesson in taste. Claire's spoon hovered mid-air. You didn't do anything to this, did you? Helen looked at her calmly. You mean like spitting into it? Claire's smile faltered. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Mark pushed back his chair. Wait, what? But Helen only stood, lifting her own plate. I think I'll take dessert in the sitting room. Claire stared at her bowl. Helen paused at the doorway, voice floating back. Let me know if you want the recipe. As Helen walked into the next room, the silence behind her fractured under Claire's gaze. The bowl sat in front of her, half-eaten. Claire frowned, unsettled. For once Helen hadn't raised her voice yet. Somehow she'd said everything. I had become a woman who could go unnoticed, but I knew how to make her feel seen. Helen sat alone in the sitting room, the low murmur of Claire and Mark's voices carrying faintly from the dining room. She held her dessert fork loosely, absently tracing its tines across the plate. The apple tart lay half-eaten, sweet and untouched, like her intention. From here she could see Claire laughing again, her posture eased, spoon in hand, as if she hadn't just disrespected Helen in front of her son. Helen watched without blinking. Every gesture Claire made now rang hollow. The mockery had grown over time. Claire's little jabs, her dismissals, the subtle barbs about traditions and overstepping, they'd chipped away at Helen's dignity like constant wind carving stone. Tonight wasn't about soup, it was about control, and reclaiming it. She rose quietly and moved to the hallway, just out of view. From there she could observe, Claire scooping another spoonful, Mark sipping wine, unaware of the emotional undercurrent swirling through the house. Claire swallowed, frowned slightly. She took another bite, slower this time. Helen watched with measured calm. She hadn't doctored the soup out of spite. She had simply returned what was hers with a little more self-respect. She knew Claire wouldn't taste anything unusual. That wasn't the point. It was the discomfort, the question in Claire's mind that was the seed Helen had planted. That seed would grow. Back in the dining room, Mark tried to restart the conversation. Claire, didn't you say something about that new client today? Claire blinked, still chewing. Oh right, it went well. She reached for her wine, her eyes darting toward the empty hallway. Helen entered slowly, her gaze steady. Everything all right in here? Claire startled slightly. Fine, just catching up. Good, Helen replied. She sat down across from Claire, folding her napkin again, her movements deliberate. Claire picked up her spoon, then paused mid-air. This tastes different. Her voice was lighter now, almost curious. Helen nodded. Could be. I adjusted the seasoning slightly. Mark raised a brow. Tastes fine to me. Claire shifted. It's better now. More balanced. I'm glad. Helen said, balance is important. Claire's eyes flicked toward her. You sure you didn't switch something else? Helen smiled faintly. I served you the same soup you served me. Claire's spoon clinked against the bowl. She stared at it, the steam rising like a whisper between them. Mark glanced between them. Wait, what does that mean? Claire stood abruptly. Excuse me. She backed away from the table, knocking her chair slightly. Helen remained seated. You seem uncomfortable. I'm fine. Claire snapped. It's just hot in here. Mark reached out. Claire, what's going on? Claire pressed a hand to her stomach, eyes wide. She swallowed hard. It's just, I served you the soup, Helen said calmly. The one you spit in. Claire blinked, her face drained of color. I didn't do anything to it, Helen continued, but I thought you should experience what you gave. Mark turned sharply. Claire tried to speak, but no words came. She turned toward the sink, coughed once, then again. The sound was sharp, wet, panicked. Helen rose slowly. You okay? Claire gasped. Something's wrong. Her hand flew to her throat. Mark was beside her in seconds. Claire, are you choking? Claire fell to her knees. Helen moved forward, watching as Claire coughed and gagged. Mark shouted, call someone. She's choking. Helen didn't flinch. She watched, arms crossed. She's fine. It's panic. Claire's coughs turned desperate. Her face twisted in fear. Mom, Mark yelled. Helen knelt beside Claire, steady and cold. Breathe through your nose. You're not choking, you're afraid. Claire met her eyes, tears streaming. You, she rasped. I did nothing to you, Helen whispered. That feeling, that's your own guilt. Claire coughed again, but this time the panic had softened. Her breathing slowed. Mark cradled her. Jesus, Claire. What just happened? Helen stood again. She tasted the truth. That's all. Claire looked up from the floor, face blotched and wild-eyed. Helen stood over her, still and calm. The room was no longer Claire's to command, and she knew it. I had fed her the same dish, but it tasted different now, like the flavor of my silence. Claire sat hunched near the dining table, her chest still heaving with residual panic. The color had begun returning to her cheeks, but her eyes held an electric edge. She looked up at Helen, not with fear anymore, but fury. What did you do to the soup? She snapped. Helen didn't flinch. She returned to her seat, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and met Claire's gaze with complete stillness. I asked you a question, Claire pressed, rising from the floor. You think this is funny? Helen blinked once, slowly. No answer. Claire rounded the table, jaw clenched. Answer me. Did you put something in it? Mark stepped in between them. Claire, slow down. She pushed past him. Don't you see? She's messing with me. First, she brings that smug silence. Then she watches me eat the soup like it's some test. Helen looked at Mark now, calm as stone. Mark frowned. Mom, is she right? Did something happen? Helen offered no defense, no explanation, only a long-waited pause. She picked up her wine glass and sipped, then placed it down with measured grace. I knew it, Claire hissed. This whole night was a setup. You made me look like a fool, like some kind of cruel joke. Mark turned to his mother. Did you do something to her food? Helen set her gaze on Claire. You spit in mine. The words were spoken without emotion, flat, factual, like reading a label, but they cracked the air. Mark's eyes widened. Wait, what? Claire scoffed. Oh, come on. I was making a point. I didn't actually think she'd retaliate. Helen tilted her head, studying Claire, like a scientist observes a curious specimen. Still, she said nothing more. Claire turned back to Mark. She's punishing me. Look at her. She hasn't said more than 10 words all night, but she's got this little smirk like she's won something. Helen smiled then. Not smug, peaceful. Mark rubbed his temples. I don't understand. What is happening between you two? Claire threw up her hands. She's playing games. She served me that soup on purpose. She wants to humiliate me. Helen's voice finally returned, low and steady. I offered you what you gave me. Claire slammed her palm on the table. Oh, don't get philosophical now. The room pulsed with unease. Mark looked between them, completely adrift. I've never seen her like this, Claire muttered, shaking her head. Just sitting there like some queen. What happened to the woman who baked apple pies and stayed out of my way? Helen stood. Her movement was slow, deliberate. She woke up. Claire's lip curled. And she wants revenge? No. Helen's voice was calm, but it cut. She wants but if that's not available, she'll settle for dignity. Mark took a step back, stunned. Why didn't anyone say anything earlier? Helen looked at her son, expression softening for the first time all evening. Because some lessons can't be taught with words. Claire gave a bitter laugh. You're so dramatic. You think this changes anything. It already has, Helen said. Claire paced to the far end of the dining room, running both hands through her hair. Mark broke the silence. Claire, maybe we need to, but Claire was already moving. Her chair scraped back with a screech. I'll be in the kitchen, she said, storming off without looking back. And trust me, I'll never forget this. The door swung open behind her, banging against the frame. Mark stood frozen. Helen returned to her chair, carefully smoothing her napkin once more. The spoon by her plate gleamed under the chandelier light. Across the room, Claire's footsteps echoed through the kitchen. A cabinet slammed. A drawer rattled. But inside the dining room, Helen exhaled, long and measured. She didn't need to follow. She had already reclaimed everything she came for. Through the kitchen door, the clatter of silverware rang like alarm bells. Helen sipped her wine, the silence now fully heard. Claire's voice rose in the distance, panicked, trembling. Something was coming. Words were useless now. What mattered was the game I'd started without her knowing. The clatter in the kitchen finally ceased. Claire re-entered the dining room, with a forced calm, her lips pulled tight into something resembling a smile, though it sat brittle on her face. She walked with the stiffness of someone who had rehearsed every step before taking it. Helen didn't look up. Claire returned to her chair, but didn't sit. Instead, she hovered, her hands gripping the backrest as if anchoring herself to something tangible. I think Claire began slowly. We've all had a little too much wine and not enough grace. Still, Helen said nothing. She poured herself another half glass, and folded her napkin over her lap. I'd like an apology, Claire added, her voice thinner this time. Mark looked up from his plate, startled. From Mom? Claire's eyes flicked toward him, then back to Helen. For trying to make me feel like a villain in my own home. Helen lifted her gaze, not sharp, not cold, just unbothered. She took a sip of wine and returned her eyes to the table. Nothing more. The silence stretched. Claire's knuckles whitened on the chair. You're being incredibly rude. Still, Helen did not flinch. Mark sat forward, elbows on the table. Okay, what is going on here? His voice was laced with exasperation. Why can't we just talk like normal people? Helen picked up her fork, and gently stabbed a piece of apple tart, chewing slowly. Claire tried again, stepping forward. I know I may have been harsh earlier, too honest. Maybe, but this silent treatment, it's beneath you. Helen tilted her head slightly, like a woman hearing a soft breeze outside the window. Still nothing. Claire's face hardened. So that's it? You're just going to sit there like a queen at a wake, judging everyone but saying nothing. Mark looked between them, confused and helpless. Helen dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin, folded it neatly and placed it beside her plate. Claire paced now, restless. I was trying to make this evening feel real. You always act like everything's fine, like we're still playing house. I thought honesty would help. Helen's voice finally returned, quiet and even. You confuse cruelty with honesty. Claire froze. Helen's hands remained still on the table. She didn't look at Claire. She looked past her, like someone who had finally moved beyond explaining herself. Mark stood uncertain. Mom, Claire, come on, can we just move forward? Please. Helen didn't answer. Claire let out a bitter laugh. You think this makes you strong, sitting there like the silent matriarch while I try to clean up your mess? Helen turned her head slowly. Her expression was unreadable. Mark ran a hand through his hair. This is getting weird. I mean, Mom, can you just tell me what's happening? Helen's eyes softened when they landed on her son. You'll understand later. The room fell into a heavy hush again. Claire shifted her weight from foot to foot, thrown off balance, not by Helen's words, but by the emptiness where words should have been. The silence was louder than any confrontation. It wrapped the room, turned tension into pressure, pressure into power. Claire turned away from the table, fuming. You're impossible. Helen stayed quiet. I gave you a seat at my table, Claire growled, and you turned it into a throne. Still, no reply. Mark tried again, softly. Mom. Helen touched his arm lightly. It's all right. No, it's not, Claire snapped, spinning back. I'll never forget this. She stormed down the hallway, her footsteps thunderous against the hardwood. A door slammed in the distance. Mark remained standing, stunned. Helen refilled her water glass, the ice clinking gently. From down the hallway, Claire's voice echoed, furious and cracking. You've made your point. Helen exhaled softly, lifting her glass. But the war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silence between us spoke volumes. She would learn the cost of disrespect. Helen sat at the head of the table, glass poised halfway to her lips. The room felt cavernous now that Claire had stormed off. Mark remained standing in the center, looking from the door to his mother. He exhaled, trembling. Mom, what did Claire do? Helen set down her wine and folded her hands over her napkin. She studied Mark, unhurried. The hush pressed heavy. Finally she spoke, voice calm but firm. She spat in my soup. Mark's eyes widened as if sunlight hit his face. The word hung between them, blunt and undeniable. He sought more. What? She spat on your food. Helen nodded still. Yes, in front of us. Mark ran a hand through his hair, anger flickering. But why? Helen's finger raised softly, halting him. Not why, she said gently. When? Mark blinked. When what? Over months, Helen said, voice low. A sneer here, a cutting remark there, masked as jokes. A constant erosion of my dignity. Tonight was the culmination. Mark sat down, stunned. I had no idea. Helen allowed a quiet sigh. I saw it. She said every time she dismissed me, redirected conversation, minimized my feelings. Tonight was just the visible part of the damage. His face went pale. I never noticed. Helen lifted her eyes. That's her aim. I'd become background. Mark swallowed. Why didn't you say anything before? Helen paused. What good would it do? It would become another moment she'd twist. Another thing I'd feel silly for bringing up. Mark flushed. I'm sorry. Helen's heart softened. It's not you. It's her choice and now ours. He leaned forward. Mom, should I apologize to you? She met him steadily. You need to speak to her. Let her know she's crossed a line. Mark nodded. I will. Helen's chest tightened with bittersweet relief. She looked at her son, not the boy she'd protected, but a man awakening to truth. Some lessons, she said, aren't affordable with words. They're earned. Mark realized the depth in her words. I understand. He reached for his phone, intent clear. He'd call Claire. Helen stood, placing her glass aside. Thank you, she said softly. Mark paused at the doorway. I'll be back soon. He walked down the hall. The door clicked shut behind him. Helen remained by the table, gazing at her plate as light shifted across the wood. Minutes passed. The quiet felt like a settling dust. Helen saw the fractures in their home, the undercurrent now visible. She rose and moved to the window, watching the hint of evening breeze in the yard. A cleansing hush followed Mark's departure. In the kitchen, Claire stood at the counter, arms crossed, face pale. She stared at the work surface as though avoiding him. Mark entered. His expression was a tight mix of anger, disappointment, and exhaustion. He looked at Claire. "We need to talk. Now." Claire's gaze flicked up. "I haven't done anything." Mark's voice cracked. "You spat in her soup. You've been tearing her down for months. She deserved to be seen." Claire's posture stiffened. She looked away. I was upset." Mark exhaled. "That's not enough." Helen watched from the dining room doorway. The distance between them felt vast, built on hidden bitterness and cowardly games. Mark pressed on, but Claire's silence became a wall. She shook her head. "I'm not talking about it." Mark's jaw tightened. "Then I'll leave. But know this. I won't pretend I didn't see it." Claire swallowed. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead she turned and walked away, leaving Mark alone, shoulders slumped. Helen watched Mark return, expression somber. What did she say? He shook his head. Nothing. Helen took his hand as he passed. Then she's chosen silence over accountability. Mark nodded. What happens now? Helen looked back at the kitchen door, then at the two departing figures. We let truth guide us. They stood in silence together, the house heavy with consequence. Mark crossed his arms. Claire's footsteps receded. Helen exhaled. Steady. The dinner had shattered illusions, and now, the daughter-in-law had shuttered her own doorway, unwilling to admit what was real, and the cost would ripple through this family. The house that once felt like home now felt like a battlefield. Mark stood in the doorway, shoulders slumped, face heavy with the weight of unspoken truth. Helen remained at the table, napkin folded precisely in her lap, her posture calm but carved from stone. She won't talk, Mark said, voice dull. She said she did nothing wrong. Helen gave a quiet nod. I thought she might. Mark crossed the room and dropped into his chair. I asked her to just admit it. To say one thing, anything. She said I was taking your side. Helen reached for her water, fingers steady. There shouldn't be sides. But when one is silent and the other spits in a bowl, the division writes itself. Mark rubbed his temple. I don't know how to fix this. You can't fix what someone refuses to see, Helen said. Her voice was soft but resolute. That's not on you. The dining room, once a place of birthdays and Sunday laughter, now felt like a neutral zone after a ceasefire. Chairs askew, silverware abandoned, silence a stand-in for the mess no one could clean. Mark looked around, the disarray unsettling. I feel like I'm choosing between my mother and my wife. Helen met his eyes. No, you're choosing between truth and denial. He swallowed hard. And what if I can't fix it? What if this breaks us? Helen's lips pressed into a line, then let it. If the only way a family stays whole is through silence and humiliation, then it's already broken. Mark leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I keep thinking about Christmas, about how we used to argue over ornaments and who overcooked the ham. Those were stupid fights, but they meant we still cared. Helen smiled faintly, sadness flickering in her eyes. They did. I miss that. Mark whispered. I do too, Helen admitted. But I miss myself more. The words landed like a closing door. Mark looked at her, startled. I spent years trying to be smaller, quieter so I wouldn't upset her. Helen continued. But tonight reminded me who I am, and I won't lose that again for the sake of comfort. Mark didn't speak, only nodded slowly. A hollow understanding bloomed across his expression. The hallway creaked. They turned in tandem as Claire appeared at the threshold. Her arms were crossed, face expressionless, but her eyes burned with unspoken accusations. I'm coming back to finish my wine, she said flatly. Helen said nothing. Mark watched his wife, unsure whether to stand or stay seated. Claire sat across from Helen, refilling her glass, her movements loud and intentional. The clink of the bottle against crystal echoed longer than it should have. Helen met her gaze briefly, not with malice, not with defiance, but with a level calm that made Claire look away. I assume we're done with the dramatics now, Claire asked. Helen remained silent, smoothing the tablecloth beneath her fingers. Mark stared at his plate, Claire drank, wiped her lips and leaned back. So, we're just going to pretend nothing happened. Helen's voice was steady. You're welcome to pretend. I won't. Claire huffed, setting her glass down too hard. Mark stood abruptly. I need air. He walked to the patio door, hands shaking. The screen slammed shut behind him. Helen rose, clearing the empty dishes with quiet precision. Claire didn't follow him. She didn't apologize. She simply stared into her wine as if it might erase the night. Helen's eyes passed over her, not cold, not cruel, but distant. Some gaps don't close. Some meals are the last ones shared without knowing. As Helen disappeared into the kitchen, she felt the quiet cement settle. This house, this family wouldn't be what it once was. But maybe that was okay. Helen stood at the sink, rinsing the plates that still held echoes of what once was. Behind her, Claire sat alone at the table. The quiet wasn't peace. It was separation, and it had finally arrived. She wanted to break me, but it was her who was unraveling under the weight of her own pride. The soft clink of porcelain echoed as Helen rinsed another plate, her movements methodical, meditative. The kitchen window was cracked, letting in the hush of the night. Behind her, the clock ticked evenly, steady and indifferent to the storm that had passed through the house. Footsteps creaked down the hallway. Claire reappeared, her heels hesitant against the wood. Helen didn't turn. Claire's voice came low, like she'd rehearsed the line. I just wanted things to feel normal tonight. Helen said nothing. Claire inched close. If I crossed a line, I didn't mean to. She stopped at the threshold, watching Helen's back. I mean, maybe you took it wrong. Helen kept scrubbing the plate in her hand. I'm trying to be civil, Claire added. Still no reply. A beat of silence passed before Claire let out an exasperated sigh. God, why is it so hard to talk to you? It's like arguing with a ghost. Helen dried the plate and placed it in the rack. I've learned ghosts speak less, but haunt longer. Claire scoffed. Really mature. Helen turned, finally drying her hands. Her face was composed, lips set in that calm neutrality that now drove Claire mad. I came back to apologize, Claire said, voice raised slightly. But clearly you're more interested in punishing me. Then you didn't come back to apologize, Helen replied evenly. Claire blinked. You came to reset the story, Helen continued. To say just enough to make yourself feel better, not to make it right. I said I didn't mean it like that. But you did, Helen's, and you do. Because every time you've mocked me or rolled your eyes at my presence, it was intentional. I just never made you look at it. Claire's mouth opened, then closed again. In the doorway, Mark reappeared, arms folded tightly. I heard all of that. Claire turned toward him quickly. Mark, please. This is being blown out of proportion. Mark's expression hardened. No, it's not. Claire reached for his arm, but he stepped back. I defended you, he said. Every time my mom said something felt off, I told her she was imagining it. Claire's voice wavered. She was never supposed to feel, but she did. Mark snapped. And you let her. Claire's composure cracked. I was under pressure. You have no idea how much I've carried to keep this family running. Helen tilted her head. And I was invisible the entire time. Convenient, wasn't it? Claire's voice broke. I was trying. No, Helen said. You were controlling. Claire looked at Mark, desperate. You're really going to take her side? Mark didn't answer. You think she's the victim here? Claire spat. She played you just like she played tonight. Helen didn't react. Claire pointed. You're manipulating him. Helen Janizid, you gave me nothing to manipulate. You did all the damage yourself. Claire's voice rose. Fine. I see how it is. You've both made up your minds. She turned on her heel, her face flushed, her steps loud and uneven. Don't expect me to come crawling back. Mark watched her go but didn't move to follow. The sound of the front door opening, then slamming rattled the kitchen window pane. Helen looked at her son. I didn't want this. I know, he said. She touched his arm gently. But I couldn't live in silence anymore. Mark nodded. Neither can I. They stood together for a moment longer, surrounded by the echoes of the night, the clatter of anger, the stillness of truth. Outside, a car engine roared to life. Mark turned toward the window, jaw tight. Helen didn't move. Claire was leaving, but what she took with her might never return. I had reached my limit, but Claire hadn't even begun to understand hers. The hum of the car engine faded into the distance. The house, once vibrant with the small chaos of shared lives, now felt hollow. Helen remained at the kitchen counter, hands braced against the cool marble. Her breath was steady, but her heart felt like a candle guttering in an open window. Mark stood beside the window, arms folded, his jaw flexed, unspoken thoughts running wild beneath the surface. Finally, he broke the silence. I don't know what to do anymore. Helen didn't look up. He continued, quieter. I can't keep choosing between you. You're not choosing, Helen said, calm. You're recognizing. Mark ran a hand down his face. It doesn't feel that way. It feels like I'm tearing this family in two. Helen finally turned. Her expression was worn, not from defeat, but from the cost of clarity. It was already torn, sweetheart. You just didn't see the rip. He looked down. She left angry. She always leaves angry. She'll come back angry too. Helen nodded. I know. Mark's voice cracked. She's my wife. I know, Helen said again, softer this time. And I'm your mother. This isn't about sides, Mark. It's about truth, and how long you're willing to ignore it. Mark looked at her, then really looked at the woman who had once sewed superhero capes and wiped away teenage heartbreaks. Now she stood tall in her silence, a strength he hadn't fully understood until tonight. She thinks I betrayed her, he said. Helen met his eyes. And how do you feel? He hesitated. I feel disappointed. Helen's gaze didn't waver. In her, in everything, Mark admitted. This house, this night, the way she treats you. I kept telling myself it was just stress, that we were all adjusting. But it's more than that. It is, Helen whispered. Mark pulled out a chair and slumped into it. Do people come back from this? Helen leaned against the counter. Some do, but only if they want to. And Claire, she shook her head slightly. She doesn't think she needs to. Mark let his head drop into his hands. How did it come to this? She's always needed control, Helen said. And I let her have it for years. But tonight I needed my voice back. A long pause hung between them. I don't blame you, Mark said, eyes red. I don't blame you at all. Helen stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. You're not responsible for her choices, but I married her, he murmured. I brought her into this family. Helen's hand tightened slightly. We all welcomed her. We all tried. Mark nodded, face heavy with realization. You're a good man, Mark, Helen said. But being good doesn't mean staying quiet. It means standing up, even when it's hard. He wiped at his eyes, embarrassed. I just wanted us all to be happy. So did I, Helen said gently, but not at the cost of myself. Mark stood again, walking to the back door. He looked out toward the driveway, now empty. She'll be back? I know, Helen said. I don't know what I'll say. You'll know when the time comes. He nodded, then turned. You're strong, Mom. I had to be. Mark stepped forward, pulled her into a quiet embrace. She let him. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the hedges. Helen felt the shift in her bones, something ending. Yes, but also something new beginning. She pulled away gently. I should finish the dishes. Mark lingered by the door. I'll help. But Helen shook her head. No. Go rest. I'll manage. He hesitated, then nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Left alone, Helen stood by the sink, the water running softly, the plate still needing attention, but she didn't move. She looked toward the front door, half expecting the knob to turn. It did, and somehow that silence was the loudest part of the night. Helen turned off the faucet and dried her hands, staring at her reflection in the dark window. Claire would come back, but whatever returned through that door wouldn't be the same, and Helen wasn't sure she wanted it to be. I no longer waited for anyone's approval. This was about my own peace. Helen eased the front door closed behind her, a soft click releasing the tension she'd carried home. The late afternoon sun cut through lace curtains, dust motes dancing, ordinary beauty after a storm. She set her bag on the bench, exhaled, and felt something shift inside. No longer someone's mother in a fractured table. Just Helen. She wandered to the living room, quietly touching books she'd shelved but never opened. Tonight she pulled one free, an old favorite by Elizabeth Bowen, and settled into the armchair. The pages smelled of comfort and possibility. She let the words wash over her, untethered from guilt or apology. A notification pinged. It was Jean, her college friend. "Coffee tomorrow? I've missed you." Helen smiled. She typed back, "Let's catch up, let's celebrate." Sending felt like a declaration. I am here. I matter. That evening, she walked through her garden, the soft hum of evening crickets under her feet. Each bloom, roses, lavender, peony, stood in quiet triumph, as if echoing her pulse. She paused by the lavender, inhaled deep and thought, I deserve this peace. The next morning, Helen lingered over breakfast, savoring silence and sunshine. She checked her phone, no message from Claire. She felt no panic. Instead, a weight lifted. The space between should I fix it and I don't have to stretched open, full of new possibilities. By midweek, she attended a pottery class, hands covered in clay, molding gentle curves on the wheel. Miss Patel admired her bowl, infused with strength. Dear. She realized her life, like that clay, could be shaped anew, soft, firm, and entirely her own. Mark stopped by in the afternoon. He'd dropped Claire at therapy. She asked for an hour. He said, sheepish. I told her she had to. He paused. I just wanted to check on you. Helen looked at him. No sorrow, no rebuke, just steady love. I'm well. He sank into a chair. I am sorry for everything tonight. She smiled gently. I know. She rose, poured tea and offered him a seat by the window. It's okay to want comfort, just not at the cost of truth. He met her gaze. I get that now. They sat in companionable quiet, watching late sunlight brush the garden. That weekend, Helen hosted a small brunch for friends. Jean, Mrs. Garcia, even Mildred from book club. The table was warm with laughter, rich with toast and honey, voices and stories. No one asked about Claire. No one whispered shame. It felt possible. Real. Later, as she cleared dishes, Lily's voice came over the phone. Mom, I love what you're doing. You sound like yourself again. Helen paused, tears unwelcome and beautiful. I love you too, sweetheart. That night, she stood in the living room, candles lit, the hours passing but no longer pressing. The house felt bigger, kind. Her reflection in the hall mirror looked calm, confident, a woman who had lost much but found more. On Thursday morning, the phone vibrated. It was Mark again. She answered, tentative but open. Mom, Claire said she's ready to talk on your terms. If you are. Helen felt her breath catch. Not fear, but recognition. The invitation lay open, but so did her boundaries. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to her own heartbeat. I'm open, she said. Helen set her mug down and straightened her shoulder. The future stretched ahead, no longer defined by others, but by the peace she'd reclaimed. And now, perhaps, by a second chance on her terms. I had fought for myself. Now it was time to fight for the future I deserved. Helen sat by the window late Friday afternoon, soft light framing her silhouette. She held a mug of chamomile tea, steam curling like a gentle sigh. The silence in her home was no longer empty. It was earned. She'd rebuilt herself on compassion and clarity, not on others' approval. A soft knock echoed and Mark entered, face thoughtful. His eyes held a flicker of remorse. Mom, he said, voice low, I need to apologize. Helen set down her mug, giving him her attention. You don't owe me apologies. He swallowed. I was blind to how Claire treated you, those jokes, her dismissive tone. I said nothing. Helen's gaze softened. We all make mistakes. But I hurt you by protecting her silence. That stops now. He paused. I want you to know I see you and I always will. Warmth bloomed in Helen's chest. She reached across and squeezed his hand. Thank you. Their moment of connection was quiet but powerful. Outside, birds dipped through golden light. Mark shifted. Claire still refuses to acknowledge what she did, or why. She called me selfish when I asked her to apologize. Helen nodded slowly. She's made her choice. He exhaled. Steadier now. So have I. They shared a long look, mother and son, bound by clarity and care. Later, Mark left to find Claire. Helen watched him go, heart clenched but resolved. The foundation had shifted, and some cracks were too wide to ignore. An hour passed. Helen resumed her day, tidying the garden, leaving fresh mint by the window. She filled her time with purpose, not distraction. Mark returned, face resolute. I told her tonight I can't continue in a marriage built on disrespect. Not for you, but for us. For my own sense of right. Helen's breath caught. What did she say? He looked after her, regret in his gaze. She said it's my side or hers. That if I stand with you, she's gone. I told her I'll leave the choice to you. A hush settled. Helen inhaled the scent of mint. I'm sorry you had to bear this. Mark ran a hand over his face. Exhaustion and relief warring in his posture. It's complicated, but I stood where I needed to. She touched his arm. You made your choice. He nodded. I stood for you, for my home. I don't know what comes next, but I know I'm no longer silent. Helen blinked back tears, not of sorrow but of fierce pride. The man who'd once held his mother's hand through childhood now held his own spine. Outside, twilight gathered. Helen rose to refill their tea. Each measured movement echoed newfound purpose. Mark took a seat by the fire, watching embers glow. I wanted to fix everything by rushing to Claire. But I can't change her. Only protect what mattered. Helen placed the cups before him. She paused, studying the quietness between them. I've waited so long for this moment, not reunion but recognition. He met her gaze. I understand now. They sat in companionable silence, a new family rhythm taking shape. Later, Mark placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Mom, whatever you decide next, I'm with you. Helen's heart brimmed. She wrapped an arm around his shoulder. I've decided already. He squeezed her hand. Outside, a car idled. Headlights swept across the window. Helen watched calm. The door opened quietly and closed. Claire stood there, pale, composed, perhaps ready to confront the consequences. Or perhaps not. In the hush, Helen's eyes held no plea, just measured understanding. Claire stepped into view, her gaze meeting Helen. The air trembled with possibility, and with the unspoken truth that some doors once opened cannot simply be closed. My silence had been my weapon. Now it was my sanctuary. Helen stood at the kitchen sink, hands folded across her chest, watching soft rain patter on the window pane. The house felt still in a way that comforted her. Since Mark's firm stance and Claire's departure, words had lost their power. Silence, purposeful and true, had become her ally. Mark joined her quietly, placing a mug of tea beside her. He didn't speak. He simply offered the gesture, and she accepted with a grateful nod. They moved to the living room, settling into the deep couch cushions. A fire crackled, warm light dancing across their faces. Silence lingered between them, but it was no longer weighted. Instead, it brimmed with something new. Mark sighed. It's quieter now, he observed softly. Helen smiled. It's honest. He leaned back, fingers tapping on his mug. I thought I'd feel lost without her. But this, he spread his hands, exhaling. This feels like breathing again. Helen reached across and squeezed his hand. You helped me breathe too. They sat like that for a while, the simple presence of each other enough. Later, Helen found herself in the garden, roots and shoots soaking in the rain. She touched the leaves, breathing in the scent of earth. The storm had passed. Green things grow stronger afterward. She thought of her own being, newly rooted in her own worth. Over the next days, Helen and Mark fell into easy rhythms. Shared breakfasts, afternoon walks, quiet evenings discussing literature. Mark began planning a retreat with Helen, to explore the nearby coast. Just mother and son, cocooning in mutual care. One evening, They sat by the fire with mugs of tea. Mark glanced toward the silent phone on the coffee table. I noticed you've barely checked it. Helen shrugged. No reason to. He nodded. Silence suits you. She laughed softly. Silence heals. She paused, gazing into the flames. I'd done too much talking for things that never deserved words. Mark looked at her with admiration. You taught me that. The following day, Helen attended a painting workshop surrounded by fresh faces and sunlight. She painted a seascape, waves crashing gently, lighthouse standing firm. It was her embodiment on canvas. Calm, resolute, illuminated. Back home, she hung the painting above the mantel. It glowed softly in the evening lamp. Mark arrived, seeing it for the first time. He stood beside her. That's beautiful, he said. It's where I am. She replied. He reached out and closed his hand around hers. And I'll walk that path with you. They stood under the warm glow, silent but bonded. That night, as Helen prepared for bed, the phone rang. The screen flashed. Claire. Helen reached out, saw Mark's concerned face in the doorway. A moment's hesitation. Helen pressed answer. Hello. Her voice was calm. She didn't invite drama or apology, just space. Claire's voice trembled. Helen. She paused, breath unsteady. I'm pregnant. The word landed like a shockwave. Helen stiffened, pulse thrumming. Excuse me. I didn't say before, Claire whispered. I didn't tell Mark. I just found out. Helen felt the hush deepen around her. What now? Claire continued, voice cracking. I know this changes everything. I know I hurt you, but I need you to know. Helen's mind roared with questions. Why now? Why? The silence stretched. Claire inhaled. I want to try again. For Mark. For the baby. Helen kept her eyes closed, breath steadying. Outside, rain tapped the window softly. Can we talk? Claire asked. Helen opened her eyes, gaze steady. The storm inside had returned. The decision lay ahead, heavier than any before. Helen's heart thundered. The room felt smaller, the world spinning. Her voice hovered, ready. But the truth was, she didn't know her answer yet. He called me disposable today. He called me his greatest strength. Helen moved through the kitchen with quiet purpose, laying a single white lily in a slender vase. The afternoon light caught the petals and cast soft shadows across the countertop. She listened as Mark entered, his footsteps light, but firm on the wooden floor. He stood beside her, eyes steady. Mom, I've arranged dinner, just us three. No pressure, no expectations. His voice held that new resolve she'd helped him find. Claire's being sensitive right now. She asked. She wants to try. Helen turned, momentarily caught by a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. Are you sure, sweetheart? Mark nodded. I need to know what I stand for. He brushed back a strand of hair. I want our family intact, but not at the cost of silence or disrespect. She placed the lily on the table and reached for his hand. Then let's do this together. Later, the table was set simply: grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, fresh bread. Helen wore a linen dress, calm and centered. Mark lit a candle. Claire arrived before them, her presence gentler than before, eyes wary but hopeful. Claire set the salad down and gave a small smile. Hello, Helen. Helen returned it, even if measured. Hello, Claire. Mark sat, placing himself between them. Shall we begin? They ate quietly at first. The glow of the candle danced over Claire's face, uncertain but open. Helen poured water. Mark watched both women steady. Claire set down her fork. I want to say thank you for this. Her voice broke lightly. I know I hurt you, Mom. I've changed. I'm pregnant. And I want this baby to be welcomed fully. Helen met her gaze. Calm, unwavering. A child deserves love and respect, she said softly. But respect must be more than words. Claire nodded, head bowed. I know. Mark leaned forward. This dinner isn't about the past. It's about what comes next for all of us. Helen inhaled. The warmth of the room pressed in, with past fractures still present in the air. We're building something new, she said. Let's do it with honesty. Claire looked up, tears pooling. I'm sorry. Mark reached across and held Claire's hand. It matters. Helen's heart fluttered. She realized they were crossing a bridge together, fragile, uncertain, and hopeful. They ate, conversation flowing slowly. Mark spoke about preparing the guest room. Claire asked for tips from Helen on family tradition. Helen answered, her voice measured with grace. After dessert, lemon pudding set with fresh berries. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. Helen, people told me you wouldn't accept me. I felt expected to fail. I was scared. Helen reached out and touched her hand in a gesture of peace, not surrender. Fear doesn't excuse cruelty, but courage can begin with apology. Claire swallowed. I'm ready. Mark smiled, his relief palpable. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Claire. Helen watched them both, imperfections still visible, but a fragile unity forming. Later, they lingered over tea. Conversation dipped into future plans. A beach visit before the baby arrives, painting the nursery, sharing stories from Helen's childhood. The wounds still laced between words, but the tone had shifted from confrontation to cautious collaboration. Mark leaned forward. Mom, this means more than you know. Helen smiled gently. It's been a long journey, but maybe here is a new start. Claire tucked her napkin into her lap. I'd like to learn from you, she said quietly. If you'll let me. Helen looked at her across the table, then turned to Mark. His eyes glowed with pride and relief. She saw her son, grown but compassionate, ready to guide them both. The room felt softer, the memory of pain still present but no longer defining. Outside, evening crept in, stars appearing beyond the windows. In that gentle gloom, Helen realized that sometimes endings and beginnings arrive at the same moment. She took a breath. Then let's walk forward, one meal at a time. Mark exhaled a contented sigh. Claire's lips quivered with gratitude. Helen looked at Mark, feeling the full circle complete, from a son who once called her disposable, to a man who now called her his greatest strength. Their future remained unwritten, but tonight, they had reclaimed something precious, and in that quiet, a fragile hope took root.